All right, is that at a loud enough level?
Talk away once.
Talk away.
Yeah, that's okay for you.
All right.
Now, do you want the ceiling mic on right away or not?
Yes, we're only going to use it for a very few minutes at the beginning, and that's it.
All right.
All right, we will begin on page 368. And it is the third choral ode, and we'll read all the way until the entrance of Creon on 371. Want to start it off, Alan?
Okay. Love unquelled in battle, love making nonsense of wealth, pillowed all night on the cheek of a girl. You roam the seas, pervade the wilds, and in a shepherd's hut you lie, shadowing immortal gods, you dog ephemeral man, madness your possession.
Go ahead.
Turning the wise into fools, you twist them off their course, and now you have stung us to this strife, for father fighting son. Oh, love, the bride has but to glance with the lyrical light of her eyes to win you a seat in the stars, and Aphrodite laughs.
Yeah.
And now you turn on me, unman my loyalty, loose my tears to see you, Antigone. Pass your wedding bower, death's chamber, pass so easily.
See me, friends and citizens. Look on this last walk. The sun's light snuffed out with my dower, and death leading me to Acheron alive, where all must sleep. No wedding march, no bridal song, cheer me on my way, I whom Hades, lord of the dark lake, wends.
Yet you walk with fame, bedecked in praise toward the dead man's cave. No sickness served you, no sword incited struck. All mistress of your fate you move, alive, unique to Hades' halls.
Oh, but I have heard what happened to that Phrygian girl, poor foreigner, the child of Tantalus, who clings like ivy on the heights of Syphilis, captures in stone petrified, where all the rains, they say, the flying snow, waste her form away, which weeps in waterfalls. I feel her trance, her lonely exodus in mine.
And she a goddess born of gods, while we are mortals born of men. What greater glory for a woman's end, to partner gods in death, who partnered them in life.
Ah, now you laugh at me. Thebes, by all our fathers' gods, you my own proud chariot city, can you not wait till I am gone? And you, sweet Dirce's stream and Theban groves, you at least be witnesses to me with love, who walk in dismal passage to my heavy tomb, unwept, unjustly judged, displaced from every home, disowned by both the living and the dead.
Perhaps you aim too high, you dashed your foot on fate, where justice sits enthroned. You fall a plummet fall to pay a father's sin.
You touch my wounds, my memories make fresh again my tears, the triple curse that haunts the house of Labdacus. The spilt and tainted blood, the horrid bed, my fated mother sleeping with her son, to father me in incest. Parents, here I come home at last, not wed, no broken spell. Brother, when you made your blindfold match, you made your death and mine to come.
Pious is as pious does, but where might is right, it's reckless to do wrong. Self-propelled to death you go with open eyes.
Unwept, unwedded, unloved I go on this last journey of all. I of the blessed sun, I shall miss you soon. No tears will mourn me dead, no friend to cry.
Well, it's almost shameful to say. I got no further than the third verse of that because I got interested in things and got carried away. There's some very pretty poetry in there, And we're going to have to cover some of it next time because there's a lot of storytelling that is in there, in the references, in the poetic references. It would really be nice. And nobody knows Greek, huh? You're supposed to know everything, Tenny. Yeah. But it would be nice to hear it in Greek, just for the sound of it. All right. The mystery schools teach that individuals are reborn time and again in different cultures and different races. And seers find that each race or each culture is under the influence of a different cultural spirit. And those cultural spirits are almost always archangels. And each of the cultures and each of the race spirits has a different flavor of consciousness. So the obvious purpose of this is to give someone a spectral kind of experience. And no doubt those flavors of consciousness are astrologically, that you come under the influence of all of the different stars. However, since it's the same reality that's being experienced through different cultures, the cultural experiences have to be parallel because reality isn't different. It's just the outlook on reality is different. So we find in places like in the writings of Plato, Socrates mentions how one god in one culture is the same god by a different name in another culture. And maybe has a few different characteristics, but they can recognize them and they can compare notes about them. And we know from looking at history that cultures rise and fall, and they have a cycle that is all their own, and it depends on the necessity of people whether that culture exists or not. If nobody needs to be born in it, that culture dies away. Now that ripeness of a culture and the individuals in that culture is something that's astrological in nature. And because it's astrological in nature, it comes from the desire world, which is sometimes called the astral world. So in the desire world and in the ripening of cultures, or the passing from one culture to another, there is an internal kind of a logic, an emotional logic, or a soul logic, or a psyche logic. We even call it psychology, is what that is supposed to mean, or we call it astrologic. In reality, it's a color logic, because by experiencing one color after another, one is brought through an experience of one emotion after another. And one emotion after another gives us an understanding of reality that is different than from passing through two other different colors. So there are experiences of greater reality from these different points of view. All of evolution is like that. It's described as spirals within spirals within spirals, almost ad infinitum, but because it is a concrete activity, there is an end to it, but there are just variations within other variations. Some of the spirals or periods of time last millions of years, if we can think of them in terms of the time that lasts by years. So we have the Saturn period and the Sun period and such like that, lasting many millions of years, perhaps billions. But in reality, the time is much more varied than the way we think of it in terms of years. It's a different way. However, the year is a good way to get a grasp of these cycles or spirals or sub-cycles. Because if we take all of the flavors of the 4 seasons, we have an understanding of what the whole cycle is like. Music used to be designed that way, and the four movements of a piece of music were supposed to be like the four seasons, and that a different theme was to be developed in each of them, and that the hearing of a symphony was supposed to be a whole experience, like the passing through one year after another. So we have almost endless varieties of experience. And these endless varieties of experience are purposefully deemed to be that way, because the being that is becoming, which is a spiritual being, some people call it a spark of God, it is eternal, like the universal spirit. And it is infinite in its potential. So when passing through all of these cycles and sub-cycles and sub-sub-cycles, each one brings out a different flavor of experience. And each of those experiences brings out a different side of that spirit that is becoming. Now, beside these cyclical or qualitative differences, there are also progressive differences. We don't just pass from a yellow period to a green period. We pass from a yellow period to a green period with a greater consciousness. So the evolutionary process is cumulative, and it's progressive. We wake up more and more. And for this reason, there's no exact repetition. Repetition in exact is impossible, because there's always more knowledge, there's always more awakening in the spirit, and so it's always new, it's always fresh. It's one spirit, but it's always different through the experiences that it goes through. Now, not only do we pass through qualitative cultures, we become better when we do so, and we become more conscious. So if we pass from a Mediterranean culture to a Northern European culture, we not only have two different flavored views of gods, we have a progressive consciousness. So that if we take Greek culture, the highest of the gods of Greece was Zeus, who the Romans knew as Jupiter. And Zeus Jupiter, we know from cosmological astrology, rules abstract thought and abstract reason. Whereas Northern European culture has Odin or Wotan as the highest divinity, and that is a mercurial god. And so for those people, concretion was more important than abstraction. They were different kinds of lessons. It was almost like saying that the consciousness of humanity in this period that goes from Greece to Northern Europe to our times is going deeper and deeper into matter, and so abstraction gives way to concretion, and so on until we come deeper into phenomenal experience. Now, because the Greeks were under Zeus or Jupiter, it's not surprising that the philosophies developed in that time, especially the Orphic philosophies of Plato and Pythagoras, were very abstract, and they're very transcendental, and they're quite lofty in their nature. In fact, a lot of those philosophers even disdained concrete experience in this world at all. They said this is just an image of the real reality, which is to be found transcendentally. And who would ever want to have the image when you can have the reality? And that's the kind of consciousness they had. And so, with that kind of consciousness, the view of Venus, or Aphrodite as the Greeks know her, was, she represented desire. And so in this first strophe and antistrophe, they are honoring Aphrodite, but at the same time they're saying that she makes people mad, and that the falling in love and all the desires that are attendant on that are sort of a degradation of consciousness. And this was typical of the Greeks. Aphrodite, or the principle of love, did not mean what love means to us in our times. And so it was almost like being drunken. Now, even if one seeks out a sensible, a natural, worldly kind of life, love and those kinds of emotions can be intoxicating and disoriented even in this world. So the Greek people who are represented by the chorus are expressing the values of that Greek cultural spirit. And so their outlook on the gods, which is their outlook on their own higher consciousness, is of that nature. Now those values, while they're important to the people that are passing through the ancient Greek culture, are not absolute. It doesn't have to be. As they saw things, it didn't have to be absolute. It was their experience, and that was enough. In fact, it's probably better if things are not absolute, because if we always maintained the view of the Greeks, life would be horrible without desire or emotion or feeling or anything like that. It would be like looking at a black and white photo, and there would be no quality to it. And if it were completely abstract, there would be no images of any kind. That's what Plato, in a way, wanted. He didn't want any images. So it's better for us, as we see things now as complete human beings and separating ourselves from cultural spirits and trying to be whole and total, it's much better that we accept the principle of emotion, desire, and feeling as it works in us, because it's for our betterment. And it's better that we tame it and find peace within ourselves, so that we are not too overly strongly influenced by our emotional experiences, than if we tried to eschew it. Because if we tried to eschew it, we would not be appreciating reality in its fullest sense. We wouldn't have the motivation that desire gives to us. We cannot rid of ourselves of things that are essential to our being. It would be like taking the flower away from a plant, going straight from the plant to the seed with no flower. You're taking away some of the essential glory of that plant, the one time that it has to show that part of it which is colorful. But at any rate, Sophocles knew all of the power of love and emotion, and he didn't disdain it. Even though he showed these attitudes, he certainly didn't say that this is the way things have to be. Being a poet, he saw its value, and he could appreciate beauty. Now, we even know that the Greeks, and certainly Sophocles, give approbation to lovers and young lovers despite their folly and the great errors that they make along the way. Now let's move to another topic, right toward the speech of the leader of the chorus. And we're going to be on that probably most of the rest of the night, about 8 lines of poetry. When Antigone enters on her way to where she's going to be sealed into a crypt or a tomb or something like that, the people are astounded, using the words of the translation, at her ease in the face of death. That's the way it always seems to be. To the masses, death is seen as a horrible thing. Now, for a few minutes, let's explore 2 different things. Let's explore reasons why she could be at ease with death. These might not be the reasons that were intended by Sophocles, but they are important reasons for anybody who's trying to grow spiritually, and it offers us the opportunity to look at some of those things. These talks don't exist for trying to read the mind of Sophocles. They are a springboard to Richard's vanity. So he can talk about whatever he wants to talk about. Now, to some extent, Antigone has been portrayed as a pious idealist, someone who acts on the basis of principle. And she's willing to die on the basis of principle. So if we follow that outlook, and she is completely noble, and she's doing with open consciousness what she's doing, we concluded earlier that she was not a tragic hero or heroine in this drama. Instead, we concluded that Creon, who in his blind obstinacy and assertion of human power, especially his, is blind to the tragedy that he's creating, and it is indeed, the play should not be called Antigone, it should be called Creon, because he's certainly a tragic hero. But I'd like to look at Antigone in a different light for a while, because maybe it isn't. You know, sometimes people who appear really nice and bathed in a golden light aren't anything like that. Now, assuming that she isn't some high initiate or some great spiritual being, at best, the ideals or the principles that she follows are from intuition. Now, I don't want to disparage idealism at all, but I want to question it, or I want to question some things about it. This is important, and it's important to me because I've always had a very strong inclination toward adamant idealism, some of which has been considered stubborn or obsessive, almost as much so as Creon. For example, there is the famous historical case of the scientist Galileo. Galileo built his telescope. It wasn't the first telescope. The Dutch had one before he did. But he turned it toward Jupiter. And he watched for a few days, and he saw 4 specks of light around Jupiter. And he concluded that they were bodies that were revolving around Jupiter. And being under the Ptolemaic concept of the universe, that everything goes around the earth and the earth stands still, when he saw the moons going around Jupiter, he concluded that this viewpoint was not true, that other things revolve around other things, and there was no reason to believe that the earth itself didn't revolve around other things. And what he did is he published his views, which outraged the church, because the church was very dogmatic about its Aristotelian view of things, which had a Ptolemaic universe to it. Now, the Ptolemaic universe is true in some ways, but there are ways that we're not going to go into now. But at any rate, the church held him accountable, and they gave him his choice of either recanting or dying. And he made an official statement in which he recanted in order to satisfy the church, but after having delivered the statement, he stamped the earth and said it moves, which was kind of a childish thing to do. But if you can't get your way, that's when little children do stamp their feet on the ground and act in a childish way. Now, for years, I have taken this historical incident as something of a touchstone to try to understand the character of people. And it's done wonders for me, but I have used it with a little bit of a touch of judgmentalism. And I have found, for example, that almost all of the scientists and the grad students that I worked with when this subject was brought up, they all said that Galileo did the right thing. And almost every one of them said because this way he could live longer and do more science. Which always brought a smile to my mind. Now, this of course reinforced my prejudice against materialistic science and scientists. But on the other hand, when I questioned most other people, there were very few who thought that Galileo did the wrong thing. And many would say, he was right anyway, so why should he discard his life if he knew he was right in the first place? And many of the few who did agree with my view that Galileo took the wrong course seemed to be something like anti-heroes. They were individualists who defined themselves by being against authority, and that was their reason for thinking that Galileo did the wrong thing. Very, very few, almost none, were lofty idealists and claimed that Galileo should have taken a stand on his ideal that he was right. And over the years, this subject has come up again and again, and I've thought on it, and I've mellowed on it somewhat. I'm still an idealist about it, and I still believe that there are causes that are worth sacrificing one's life for, but only after a considerable amount of self-examination do you do that, because such a sacrifice can be very powerful, but it can only be powerful if it is done with pure motivation. So I still believe that Galileo was wrong, because he should have stood for what he thought was right. But is universal gravitation a cause to give your life for? Maybe yes, maybe no. I also think that one doesn't have to do what one does to change the consciousness of society without a lot of fanfare. It doesn't have to be that you announce to the world and that like the grand opening of the Olympics with fireworks and pageantry and everything like that. It's usually much easier to change the consciousness of the world by not doing things like that you can influence people and depend on the truth to catch on with something like spontaneous combustion. And so I have a little bit different view about Galileo. Now, there's something about this topic, that is being willing to give your life for the sake of what is an ideal, or what you think is an ideal. It's something like capital punishment. If you're wrong, you can't go back and correct. That alone should be a reason why we don't have capital punishment. Why should we kill an innocent person because we might have made a mistake? In fact, in most states in which capital punishment is enforced, that has indeed happened. They have found out that some of the people who have been killed by capital punishment were innocent of the crime for which they were killed. And I don't call it execution, it's killing. It's murder, it's just a societal murder, and it's not a personal murder. Now, the reason I say this is because there have been a lot of people who have believed in principles, and some of them have died for those principles, and those principles were not true. Many have died for causes that were illegitimate. If we think about all the deaths that happened at Jonestown, or if we think of what happened at Gallipoli, those were horrendous things. Now, as we said earlier, and the way it looks on the surface, Antigone is sort of cast in a golden light, and she seems to be quite virtuous. Some obsessives are quite virtuous also. Is she an idealist or is she an obsessive? So it seems that her actions, her motivation need to be questioned. As if we were Antigone and we were taking a vital stance on an issue, we need to question ourselves. Perhaps there really was a religious belief that a corpse was sanctified by being covered with dirt. There are those kinds of laws. There are a lot of biblical laws, and some of them are quite strict. In the Bible, a man violates the Sabbath, and Moses goes and talks to God and says, what should we do with him? He was caught picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and God says, stone him to death. It's pretty interesting. It's pretty severe. Perhaps it was one of those laws, the law about burying the dead, that was actually like some dietary laws. They were actually for the health of the people. Because if you leave bodies lay around, there's a likelihood for cholera. And maybe that's the reason why the law was there. However, when Antigone speaks, her stated reason for doing what she does is for the sanctification and for the love of the dead. Now, the issue of a man-made decree came into call also because she was defiant of the man-made decree by Creon. Now, when it comes down to that, she could possibly have had a rebellious ego problem. She was pretty strict, and she wasn't really loving, and egoists are never really loving, so that's possible. Even with Haman, there's nothing to indicate that she's tenderly in love with him. It's just not in the character as it's described. In her arguments, she always appeals to divine law and not to some other use of reason or something like that. She doesn't give a history of the law. She doesn't give anything like that. So perhaps she is an obsessive tragic hero, someone who learns only after her death. And it is almost like the crowd is feeling about her. Sometimes when people do things like that, it's a common thing to hear words like, oh, what a waste of such a young and promising life. But if the desire body holds such a sway over the general character that she's bound by obsession to defy any kind of law, maybe death is the only cure for that kind of grip on a person's life, and maybe she needs to come back and start all over again without that being the case, with the period of time in between where she could see how wrong she was, if this is true. So it's possible that there are, if we look at her this way, that there are two tragic heroes in this play. Only one of them learns after death and one of them learns before death. To examine her a little bit more closely, let's go back and recant and look at something else from a different point of view. Let's go back and look at her interaction with Ismene. And Ismene earlier said, all right, if you feel it's that important, go ahead and bury the body. But don't make a big ordeal out of it. Just bury it and don't do it openly, publicly, and defiantly. Now, to us at first, again, looking superficially, it looked like Antigone was correct in saying that Ismene had no courage. She had no courage at all because she wasn't willing to stand up for what she did. But we see that in a way she did have courage, because later on she was willing to forfeit her own life. So we should look at this question. So let's ask, why does it have to be open in public? Maybe it's something that can be done otherwise. If it was only to consecrate Polynices, it wouldn't have to be a public activity. It could be done quietly. However, if it was that, her motive was more for the concern of her brother. But it appears that it was something else. It appears that it was a symbolic act. And there are reasons to think that is so. For example, it could be that she was pious and that she thought that such an act would re-arouse people's interest in religion, and that they would rebel against the political activity taking over the state when it should be spiritual. Doesn't seem likely, because she was religiously convicted of her cause, and she did arouse some sympathy in the people, but not much. There was more sympathy for her personally than there was for religion. And she didn't exhort people to her cause. In fact, she scolded them, and that's hardly a way to rouse people to your cause. It could also be that for her it was a symbolic issue to be what she stated, divine law versus human law, and that she personalized her case, meaning that she personally was obsessed with human law. In that case, she would be what people call a spoiler, a troublemaker. And in fact, on page 358, at what is line 32 of that episode, Creon asks her if she is flagrantly disobeying the law. And she says, naturally. So she is a spoiler. It's obvious that at least part of her purpose is to identify herself as somebody who is against things, a contrary. So she is at least partly rebellious and probably obsessive. Now, if that's true, one wonders how and why someone comes to such a psychology of obsessiveness. Now, since this is only one brief lecture, that can't be answered in depth or comprehensively, but we can talk about a few little things of it. One very simple, almost simplistic answer is that such a character is the externalization of a deep-seated, intractable character flaw. It's like getting it out there. It is projected onto society, and in this case it's projected onto Creon, but that's why this kind of personality exists, why the spoiler is there. Not necessarily speaking of it in terms of society, but in terms of the spoiler. It is, they're trying to externalize a problem that they've been working with. And no doubt it is a problem that has been around for a long time, because obsession is not a mild condition at all. It's probably been there for several rebirths. My astrological experience is that most obsessiveness is associated with fixed signs, and people who have a lot of planets in fixed signs are obsessive about some things. Now, obsessions are impossible to overcome. Part of the reason is because the struggle is personalized, and the character is a whole. It's a closed system. And so it's impossible to obliterate part of your own being. You can't subdue part of yourself. And if you try to do so, all you do is strengthen it. So trying to overpower something that you're obsessive about is bound to failure. What is necessary is to get at the principle within and to transform, not overpowering, because that has to fail. This might only be an hour. So externalization is an attempt to objectify. It's necessary. Unless we can see for ourselves our behavior as objectively manifest, which is easiest done if something is externalized, it's hard to overcome it. But when we externalize, that raises the stakes. Because if we externalize it, there's also an attempt to depersonalize it, to say it's not mine, it's out there in the world. It's not my behavior, it's behavior. And I can't, I put it out there and it isn't necessarily me. Because what happens is, I'm sure that if Antigone were confronted with this, which she was by Creon, who was himself being equally personal, she would project and say that the problem is with Creon. It's with society, or it's with an enemy. But no matter if society or the enemy disappear or capitulate, the problem still continues. That's the trouble with obsessiveness. So what we're trying to do here is something that's very difficult. We're trying to determine what is obsession and what is impersonal inspiration. The acts of each are often the same, but the interpretation of those acts and the consequences of those acts also varies from person to person. Let's take a famous example from history. Gandhi said, "I'm going to walk to the sea and make salt." And this was in defiance to the salt tax that the British put on the people. And they said that you can't go to the sea and evaporate water and make your own salt that way. So Gandhi started walking, and it was a long walk, hundreds of miles. And in the course of things, he attracted a multitude of people. And surrounding him was the inner group from his ashram. And they were schooled in nonviolence. And they were willing to suffer brutal treatment. The result was a police riot. The police beat up on them, and they didn't fight back. And the British, because there were filmings of it all, and the British were shamed before the entire world for their brutality. And it was the beginning of the end of British rule at that point. They had something that was externalized also. They couldn't say that we are superior people, that to the people of India, and that our rulership of India is actually a benign thing. That was their objectification. Now, to some, mostly the British, they would say that Gandhi was a troublemaker, that he was a spoiler. To some others, who would probably be psychologists, they would say he was an obsessive, irrespective of his success and the external world. He was unrealistic in his expectations, and he was obsessive. To others, he would be seen as a divinely inspired man, an idealist that is strengthened by the courage of his spiritual and moral conviction. Who's right? Probably all three are right. He was indeed a troublemaker, because wherever he went, you have to judge him by his fruits. Wherever he went, he spawned riots. And every riot was at least a little bit lethal. He himself had great misgivings, and he quit his career early on because of the violence. And he felt maybe he was just a troublemaker because he believed in cause and consequence. By his own admission, he was compulsive. It took his wife that had to throw his compulsive behavior in his face for him to become aware of it. And like all compulsives, he put himself in impossible situations, and he also put himself in possible situations. He would set up trials for himself that he was sure to win, just to prove that he was right. He questioned whether his ends or his expectations were realistic. and he questions himself as severely as the psychologist was. Clearly, he was also ethically and spiritually inspired. He never did anything crazy. He was always rational. He didn't claim to have any divine powers or any special vision or anything like that, but he was clearly humane and he was clearly spiritual, and following his life, it shows a life of progress. He improved all the way through life. He influenced others to the good, and they improved themselves both morally and spiritually. And most of the people that he attracted close to him were high-minded people. So, Gandhi and perhaps our fictitious Antigone were psycho-spiritual mixes. But the question is, how do we separate the mix? Because we don't want to be idealist, if meaning idealist means that we have to have compulsive behavior. So some of the things that we've already seen in the analysis of Gandhi give us some clues. Are we spawning violence and resistance in what we do? Do we set up pseudo-trials for ourselves and boogeymen? Do we try to do impossibly hard things and have expectations that are counterproductive? Do we try to completely overpower instead of transform? That's the big one. Do we, in fact, do for the world what we do in a positive way? What kind of people do we attract around us? And who do we associate with? These are all pretty good indications to tell us whether we're obsessive or whether we're idealistic, and what parts of us are which. We're talking about being successful in the world, and we're talking about the people that are around us. We're not talking about conquering the world. We're talking about making slow, steady spiritual progress, because that's what we were looking for. Now, all of these things that we've just looked at are excellent criteria. And most of them have something in common. But all of them are non-mystical. They're mostly psychological things or socio-psychological things. Of course, they require examination, interpretation, and good sound judgment. Now, those qualities are, for the most part, internal qualities. And they depend on some success internally before the fact. So there's something of a catch-22. Before we can judge ourselves, we have to have made some progress in judging. Meaning we have to be in touch with that in us which is capable of judging and judging correctly and well. The mysteries from times of antiquity have a much more internal answer to determine what is inspiration and principle versus what is obsession. From one of the precepts of one of the ancient mystery schools, the statement was, know thyself. Know thyself. Meaning to say that before you can proceed with a lot of external action, you have to know where you're coming from. At least to some extent you have to have had success with that, or everything else might be askew. So it is mandatory for spiritual process that we know ourselves inwardly. And the obvious thing is we need to cultivate inwardness. We have to come to know ourselves and enjoy ourselves. We have to cultivate so that we can tell what's the difference between an intuition and what is an impulse coming from the desire body. Because the internal adversary can project things that seem very much as if they were principles that were intuitive. So self-knowing, self-observation, just even for itself alone, it's a wonderful thing. If you can spend time with yourself and really understand what's going on inside of yourself, there's a lot to appreciate there. So spirituality doesn't just happen to us. We have to grow intentionally, because we grow and become from within, and there's no substitute for the work that is necessary for us to become as we need to become. If we practice self-knowledge, we can tell what is intuition and what is impulse, what is camouflaged and what is genuine. If we practice self-knowledge, we can intuit if we are really serving the divine within, or whether we're laboring under some egoistic delusion. We examine ourselves regularly. We realize that everything we do isn't perfect. Because if we did, we would already be divine beings. We would be initiates with godly powers. And that isn't the fact. So it must mean that the spirit within can't trust us with those powers yet, because we really do not have control of that. So are we sacrificing from some sort of martyr complex? The only answer can come from the intuition within. Unfortunately, the people that do act obsessively never question what they're doing. If they're not questioning, they're not thinking. If they're not thinking, they cannot receive impulses of truth from within. All right, we originally set off on this exegesis to determine what kinds of things make death pass easily, or make it easier to pass death, as the leader of the chorus says with all of that poetry. We have determined two things that can make death pass easily. And the two are often confused one for the other. One is obsession, and the other is courage of conviction. I'd like to look at this more, but it's too much time. So let's look at it in a different way. Sometimes death is euphemistically called the transition. And what is meant by that is that there is a transition from one state of being to another state of being. So in looking at it in this way, death is a turning point. And it's a very major turning point. A lot of philosophers, especially Rudolf Steiner, like to speak of turning points. It's a way of looking at a moment or the activity of a moment in a non-static way, which is a spiritual way. Matter wants things to be constant. Spirit, everything is constantly changing. It's alive and it's dynamic. Now, obviously, some of these points are more important than others. Birth and death are very important points. In history and in evolution, some moments are more important to others because of the relationship that they have to the intent of what is transpiring in history and evolution. In reality, every moment is a turning point from the actual of the past to the potential of the future. So one could say that the present moment, the relationship of it to the potential, is about presence in the moment. Now, apparently the leader of the chorus which has concerns about transition. They're concerned about death. As we've been seeing all evening, many people, especially the masses, have concerns about death. They have a hard time accepting it. Other people have hard times accepting other moments, other turning points. Some people can't accept birthdays. Some people have a hard time accepting tax days. Still other people have difficult times with the next meeting with their boss or with their lover. If we look at moments or at turning points in an extremely abstract way, all of this seems absurd. Consciousness is going to pass from one moment to the next, whether we worry about it or not. And all we do, if we do worry about it, is take ourselves out of the moment. It's very hard to tell that to a person who worries, though. Our concern is due to something that we have or haven't done in previous moments, usually things we haven't done. We're concerned about meeting our lovers because maybe absent-mindedly we said something unkind the last time we saw them. We're concerned about an upcoming exam because we haven't been studying. We're concerned about death because we feel we haven't done the things that we were to do. Or we're concerned about death because we did the things that we felt we shouldn't have done. Implicit in both of these ideas about death is a belief in cause and consequence. That this is the turning point from a state where we initiate causes to a state in which we receive consequences, which is a pretty good assessment of the major turning point of death. Now there's something ironic about this. If we dissociate ourselves from living in the moment, we believe that time, or what is manifest in time, spans the moment of death, or any other moment. So we dissociate ourselves from the moment of death, even though we believe that consciousness spans the moment of death, and so our dissociation is ironically against what we know and what we believe. Our acts contradict our beliefs, or what we intuitively know to be true. We dissociate ourselves from the moment of truth instead of participating in the truth of the moment. That's what the big problem is. So we're speaking about coming to a point, and we're speaking about presence in the moment, and we're speaking about participation in the present. We're speaking about concentration. We're speaking about concentration of attention to be conscious of reality. Geez, we're almost done already. Wow. A record. This is why concentration and paying attention or focusing attention is the most basic of all spiritual exercises. One cannot do anything spiritually if one cannot control one's attention. Consciousness comes through the control of attention. Accomplishment of higher consciousness or higher states of consciousness through all the other spiritual exercises depend on concentration. If one cannot concentrate, one cannot do much of anything with consciousness. From what we have just seen, practicing meditation without having arrived at a meditative state by concentration is a form of dissociation, because you're dissociating from participating in the truth of the moment. And that's at least partly counterproductive if we're looking for spiritual growth. If one practices concentration and practices it very deeply and does it correctly, one passes through into a meditative state. And when one does, one arrives at that meditative state with a keen alertness. And that is a better way to approach an abstract state of consciousness. The way we're looking at concentration right now, with regard to the issue of passing lightly by death, is in its long-term effects, not in the expedience of how do I put this thought in mind or something like that. We're looking at the long term. We're looking at what we do being what we become. And one long-term effect of practicing concentration is an acceptance and an appreciation of reality as it is. And it's not merely a cynical existential acceptance that says this is the way things are and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not that kind of existentialism. This is a positive, appreciative acceptance. It's positive because we have positively put our energy into it. Moreover, concentrative awareness, when it has been effective, it arrives at that state by free, deliberate, self-conscious activity. One has to have that soul stance in order to be capable of doing something. So it's not clear that Antigone has practiced concentrated attention, but concentration is the one thing that facilitates the passing of death or other moments of experience which are often difficult to accept, because one can see them for what they are and one has a positive attitude that one can do something about them, and one can pass them with relative ease compared to if one does not practice concentration. And that's all I have for tonight. Next time we'll have a bunch of storytelling.